They clapped for my name like it was a costume. He raised his glass and called me provided for, while I stood in a borrowed suit that pinched at the neck and smelled faintly of someone else's cologne. I drove home in a Ford that wheezed and coughed. I went to bed with my pockets empty and woke up with a single word settling into my chest: allowance. My name is Tom, and I live in Texas. The night my son told a room full of people he gave me $10,000 a month, I had nothing in my bank account. That's when I realized I was being used. If you care about truth, if you've ever been underestimated, hit like and subscribe. Stay with me. This one is for anyone who's had their life turned into someone else's trophy. The borrowed suit was a lie that fit better than truth did that night. I still remember the weight of the jacket on my shoulders, too heavy in the chest, like a man wearing someone else's expectations. The sleeves swallowed my hands. The collar pinched like a quiet reprimand. I'd borrowed it from a neighbor because my own shirts had given up on pretending to fit a life that had narrowed around grocery bills and midnight broom handles. I'd spent years scraping some dignity together from second-shift pay and cheap coffee. That night, the house was full of bright shoes, names on placemats, and people who smelled of success. And my son, tall, clean-shaven, his voice practiced and loud in a room that ate up attention, made me the centerpiece. I give my father $10,000 a month so he can live comfortably, he said, slow and broad, and the room dissolved into applause and laughter like somebody cued it. Isn't that the cruelest kind of thing? To be made into an emblem, a token of your child's success, while the thing they're praising is a fiction that presses at your throat. I stood there like a prop, a man on a stage with the right face for gratitude. The applause felt like moths against my ribs. I could hear the clink of glasses, the rustle of silk, the quiet applause of people who had no idea what they were applauding. His wife, sharp as a pin, all buttoned sleeves and white teeth, smiled at me the way a portrait does, perfectly placed. No warmth, only this small, precise angle of the mouth that said, "We have written the ending. Do not attempt to rewrite it." When she followed me to the terrace to check on me, her voice was the sound of polite violence. "Your son takes care of everything. You should be grateful." She said it with the kind of calm that comes from practice. "You mean the 10 grand?" I asked, and it was the worst thing I could have said because her smile tightened, and she leaned in like a predator who polishes before the kill. "Maybe you forgot," she said. "It would be a shame if anything disrupted that." Threat wrapped in silk. A napkin with blood on it and a smile across the table. I came home that night to a heater that coughed like it was getting ready to die, to a jug of water in the fridge, to beans and the faint smell of oil in an apartment that had always measured out how much it could give me. My Ford watched me from the street, the rust like a patient animal. I logged into my bank account because the words 10,000 were moving around in my head like a hard pebble. Nothing, no mysterious deposits, no new number that made my rent less of a beast. So the pebble became a stone. I wrote everything down: date, place, exact phrasing, people who were there. The club was a memory on paper, the way you make funerals of untruths. I need you to picture the first time I found the thread. It was by accident, because accidents are the true collaborators in revelations. I had gone into my son's office, an excuse about something small, a coffee mug I'd left behind or a book I'd promised to take back. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and leather. On the desk, a checkbook lay open like evidence that someone trusted themselves to print wealth. Monthly checks, all in the same handwriting, all signed, $10,000, $10,000, $10,000, and the payee read Esmeralda's. Not my name. Not Tom. My fingers went cold. There were other things, smaller checks paid to SM Holdings, a letter from an accountant suggesting dependent support, and the creation of a trust named T.H. Care, my initials, a spreadsheet titled H Support with notes, paid via trust, consolidated. It all fit together in that awful way that means planning. I pressed my phone up to the paper, took pictures with hands that shook, and left before she came home. That night, I called an old friend named Patrick, who'd become a lawyer. 2 words went into my notebook like nails. Document everything. He told me we needed a pattern, not just a story. A pattern becomes a map becomes a case. I bought a tiny recorder that clipped to my keys the next day. Texas lets you record conversations. That detail felt like luck. I called my son. I asked him to explain it, slow and steady. It's complicated, he said. Trusts, consolidation. You're taken care of? Then, maybe you need to see a doctor about your memory. He hung up. I saved the recording 3 ways. When I started to look, other people began to be the margins to the story. Maria, a neighbor who managed the house where they lived, had a small, careful kindness. When I asked if she'd seen checks, her hand shook just a little. She slipped a folded copy of an envelope into my palm. The return address was my son's office. The front read SM Holdings. Janet from the grocery store where I stocked shelves at dawn started running numbers with me over the lettuce and milk. A junior accountant named Alan reached out later because some men carry conscience like a stone in their pocket. He handed me emails with instructions telling staff how to code transfers so they would look like support without actually going to me. Keep parent support number stable. Move actual to S. He will never check. 1-line read. Alan had printed only what he thought he could live with. Patricia, the quiet, unshowy lawyer I eventually hired, looked at everything and said one thing that I still hear in my head. This is strong. Not because of one item, but because the pieces fit. You need proof when you're accusing someone who wears charm like armor. Patricia taught me how to move like water, quietly, without splashing. She told me to preserve everything, get sworn statements, and for God's sake, don't confront them in a way that gives them time to clean the plan out of sight. That was the first night I learned what being underestimated tastes like. It tastes like someone announcing you are fine while stealing your name to make a ledger look pretty. It tastes like salt and iron and the urge to put both hands around a throat and squeeze. But there are laws for a reason, and Patricia was the map. She told me to breathe. She told me to make the folder my altar. So I made a folder, photograph of the checks, copies of emails, Maria's sworn note, Alan's prints, Patrick's sticky legal notes. Each piece felt like a tile in a mosaic that, once finished, would show the face of the man who'd used my name to hide a trail of cash. The problem with this kind of theft is how easily people accept a story if it smells of generosity. My son's words, "I give my father $10,000 a month," were a scent that coat the room in absolution. People like to believe in redemption arcs. They like to believe in the good that money can buy. They like to sit at the table and applaud the narrative of success. The internet, in turn, was kinder than the room. I wrote a short post, no names, just the facts. A father in a borrowed suit. A son who announced $10,000 a month. No money in the bank. People messaged. Some told similar stories. A local page picked it up, and then a reporter called with the soft voice of someone who keeps their pen ready. The thing that steadied me was the chorus. Messages came in. You're not alone. Check this. Don't stop. That chorus became a wind beneath the sails of my terrible, necessary obsession. But then the threats started. My son called and weaponized the language of care. He mentioned capacity hearings and went on about how these things are, for the family's good. A lot of men throw the word capacity like a grenade, because it smells like concern but explodes into control. It scared the kind of people who stay quiet, but not me. I put those words next to the photos and the emails and the folded envelope Maria gave me. We filed preservation notices. Patricia and I moved like a team of quiet medics. The DA began to listen. Agents executed search warrants. They found ledgers and spreadsheets, and, worse, a scanned signature that looked nearly like mine, authorizing transfers to an entity that didn't exist. The signature had a tiny flattening in the last letter of my name that my real signature doesn't have, a detail only noticeable if you look hard enough. Forgery is one of the most intimate crimes because it's not only your money that's stolen, it's your handwriting, your history. Somebody shaped my past in order to move the present. The ledger had columns that whispered, S. Morales, SM Holdings, TH Care, names like desks in a house built on taking. I stood in court a month later with the folder in my hands and felt my breath make a small cloud. I thought of my Ford, the heater that coughed, the beans. I thought of the borrowed suit and the way applause can sound like knives. The DA's office, Jennifer, who came into the case like a woman used to doing the heavy, unseen work, listened without show. She arranged forensic accountants and subpoenas that made people who thought they were clever look like men who forgot how to sweep their own trails. We won the subpoenas. Agents found scanned copies, emails with instructions, a condo bought in cash by SM Holdings with the same return address as the envelopes Maria had given me. The threads were no longer edges but fabric. But the part I remember best from that early stage is the night I returned to the investment club. He was giving the same talk he'd given months before about legacy and generosity. The room smelled of navy wool and success. I walked to the microphone and said simply, I heard you tell a room full of people you give me $10,000 a month. I went home to a rusting Ford. If that's true, show me the paper. If not, why use my name to make yourself look generous? I expected shame. I expected some human thing to shift. Instead, at first, there was stunned silence, the kind that makes chandeliers seem louder. Then a man from the back stood and said he'd seen patterns like this. Phones came out. People started to speak, not with the easy comfort of applause now, but with the sharp curiosity of people who suddenly sense a rip in the fabric. That night, strangers offered me rides, a forensic team, names of journalists. Margaret, who'd sat near the stage and applauded, took my hand after and said, If this is what you say it is, I will go to the DA with you. People who had been part of the audience now became witnesses, because once a story slides past the applause and onto people's tongues, it becomes harder to ignore. We had a case that smelled like evidence and not just a son's charm. The middle of any fight is the place where you find out what you're made of. It is a slow, often ugly reveal. Once the DA began to move, the family shifted gears. The phone calls increased. My son's tone hardened into something cold, the kind of voice that has rehearsed cruelty. He started showing up at the apartment building sometimes, standing in the doorway, like a judge in a robe of indifference. He'd call and speak quietly about concern and our family's reputation, as if reputation were a blanket you could throw over a live animal. He began to accuse me publicly and privately of being confused. "Maybe you forgot," he said, in a voice that made it clear he believed his own narrative. That phrase, "maybe you forgot," became a kind of taunt. There are two things people forget when they try to gaslight someone. 1. Documentation, and 2. The stubbornness of the person who sees what they saw. I had a recorder. I had photos. I had sworn statements. But feeling the accusation land was different than producing evidence in cold light. The accusation is a coal in the bed. It burns differently at night. The DA's office began issuing subpoenas. Bank accounts were frozen. I watched as the world I thought I knew, my son's office, the condo, the firm where he had woven his story, became a stage for people in suits who moved like someone trimming a garden of lies. Agents came to ask questions. They knocked on doors and took boxes of files. My son's wife started to act like someone under pressure. She was quieter in public, her smile thinning. But the legal machine is slow, and that gave both of them time to plan, to rewrite, to lean on the idea that wealth buys you narrative control. They used, "We thought it would help" as a defense, papered in the language of good intentions. It's an old trick. Try to make greed sound like foresight. When the agents found the scanned authorization with my flattened letter, my stomach dropped. This was forgery. Suddenly what had been family infighting was now identity theft, tax fraud, elder abuse, crimes with teeth. The meaning of the checks changed from symbolic to criminal. People who had laughed were now quiet. People who'd clapped felt the backs of their necks cool. But this wasn't simple. For every piece we had, they countered in ways you'd expect from practiced liars. My son hired lawyers who tried to frame the case as a misunderstanding. They claimed that the entries meant different things, that support was an accounting label and not money in my account. They tried to say the trust had been designed to protect me, to keep funds managed. They said things in soft legal language that smoothed edges into plausible deniability. Meanwhile, my life was less about courtroom strategy and more about chores of survival. There were nights I sat on the edge of my bed, counting bills with the slow, solemn attention of someone who keeps score for a living. There were mornings I wiped down shelves at the grocery at 5 a.m., my back humming, while my mind replayed the club, and the words and the way applause had felt like a shove off a cliff. The press began to sniff around. That felt strange. Exposure is like sunlight. It kills some things and feeds others. I got offers to write, to sit on panels, which is something I never would have pictured. People wanted to know what I had done, how a man who cleaned warehouses and drove a rusting Ford stopped being a prop and started being evidence. But the legal fight introduced a new kind of loneliness, scrutiny. Journalists wanted neat quotes. Neighbors whispered. My son's friends looked at me with the careful pity people afford someone who's been through something. There were whispers of an inheritance discussion, of protecting family privacy. It felt like the house of my life had been built with doors that only opened inward. The DA's team worked with accountants who could read spreadsheets like maps. and see where lines of numbers crossed into fraud. Jennifer, the assistant DA, had a way of asking questions that made people fumble. She liked evidence, not drama. That steadied me. The agents executed search warrants at the office and found ledgers and scans and emails. One of the things that hurt the most was seeing how methodical it had been. The way they'd created names and entities to hide cash movement. The way a condo could change hands in the ledger with a return address that matched a stack of envelopes we'd found. Still, as the machine moved, there were setbacks. My son's lawyers motioned to exclude certain emails as privileged. They brought in sympathetic witnesses who painted a portrait of a son trying to help his parents stay safe. They argued that paper could be interpreted in many ways. It felt like watching a magician work whenever they did this. Distract here, mislabel there, and the audience, if they wanted to, saw nothing. One night, after a particularly bruising hearing where the judge had been polite but non-committal, I sat on the steps outside the courthouse and thought about forgiveness. That's a trick question people ask you when you're furious. Will you forgive? I remember thinking, not for the first time, that forgiveness is not an event. It's a skill you either develop or decline. But justice is not a substitute for forgiveness. It's a ledger entry. There were moments of real tenderness, too. Maria came to court and sat in the back. She held my hand in the hall like someone holding a candle in a church. Alan, the accountant, who'd risked his job by sending us the internal emails, called to say he was proud to be useful in a way that didn't cost him his sleeping heart. Janet the grocer brought me a pie once and told me to keep my head up, small kindnesses that felt like scaffolding. And then the strain of it all did something ugly. It pushed my son further. He became reckless. He made offhand comments in public that sounded like threats. He stopped pretending to be apologetic and started acting like a man who decided to double down. He suggested openly, in the kind of voice used to unsettle, that my memory was failing. He began whispering about capacity hearings again. The insinuation was clear. If they could convince the court I was unfit, the trail ended. That's where the fight turned visceral. It's one thing to prove fraud on paper. It's another to stand in front of a room and say, with evidence on the table, that a person's memory is intact and that love hasn't been co-opted into a ledger. I had to demonstrate that I knew the dates, that I could recall conversations with sequence and detail, that I was not the kind of vulnerable elder they hoped to isolate. That's why every recorded call, every photograph, every name on a receipt mattered. The strain showed in my hands occasionally. I'd be writing in the folder and my pen would skip. I'd get lightheaded in court sometimes when the opposing counsel asked me to explain something they knew I had documented. They tried to trip me up, to find a way to make me look like the unreliable man they'd been whispering about. But throughout, there was a small, stubborn thing inside me, the knowledge that my name had been used without my consent. That kept me steady in ways I later could not have explained to a jury without the laundry list of receipts and sworn statements at my back. And then, the real turning point, the one that split the story into before and after, came in the form of a careless email and a quiet man who couldn't hold his tongue. Alan, the junior accountant who'd given us emails, alerted us when he noticed a thread of messages within the firm suggesting the creation of an SM Holdings shell to manage family assets. In one of those emails, someone wrote something like, "Keep parent support number steady. Route actual payments to S. Morales." It was a throwaway line for someone who thought themselves invisible. For us, it was a lighthouse. We presented that email to the DI. It was a small, direct thing that made the whole plan look less like a misunderstanding and more like a strategy. Jennifer put together the pieces in a way that the judge could not ignore. They executed a search warrant on the condo and on the office computer servers. One of the warrant returns included an image of a scanned page, a bank transfer authorization that had a signature almost my own. That signature was the hinge. It told us someone had taken my name and tried to make it work for their calculations. For the first time in the fight, I felt the tide move. It was not a wave of vindication. It was a slow, steady drift. You could feel the room shift when the evidence was presented. Colleagues looked down at their phones, friends looked at each other in odd silence, and my son, for all his composure, had a moment where he looked like a man who had just glimpsed a mirror and did not like what he saw. But the first real, audible victory was small. The DEA charged them with forgery and elder financial abuse. The list of charges read like a novel, and yet it felt unreal. Charging someone is not the same as conviction. It is the beginning of a process that can be noisy and ugly. Still, even a charge is a mark on a map. It tells the world that someone is now looking. We took comfort in procedural things after that, in the tiny victories like a subpoena that actually stuck, or a bank being compelled to produce records. We celebrated like prisoners freed for the day, small, shy triumphs. But I want you to understand the emotional weather of this period. It was not catharsis. It was exhaustion. It was the way your spine feels after a storm passes, when you realize how much you bent. And in the middle of that exhaustion, some of the worst emotional violence came not from lawyers or judges, but from people who had once been near us. There were invitations that stopped arriving. Family members who used to call stopped. The son I had raised began to behave like a man who had decided his future had to have no space for me. It hurt more than anything, because it felt like a deletion, not of money, but of history. It was like someone holding up a scrapbook and ripping out the pages where your name appears. But you survive because you must, not because you are heroic. I kept making files. I kept sleeping badly because sleep is for people who let go early. I jogged sometimes more for the steady rhythm than for fitness. Put one foot in front of the other and let the mind settle. I started speaking quietly in senior centers about the small things that keep you safe. Keep manuals, keep the originals, have a trust you control, keep a notebook. Talking was part therapy, part strategy. It was also a way of refusing to be hidden. The turning point begins with a decision. To let anger be the engine or to make it the tool. I chose tools. Sitting with Patricia and Jennifer in a small conference room, the kind with a table that has seen many small wars, we started building a plan not to humiliate anyone, but to make the facts unavoidable. We wanted a story that couldn't be waved away with charm, with soft words about good intentions, or with gaslit allegations about memory. Patricia wrote underlining like a blueprint. "We don't win by yelling," she said. "We win by making the ledger sing," Jennifer agreed. "We will not allow a capacity hearing to be the blind spot," she said. "We will document every call, every conversation, bring in the people who know you, and show the continuity of your life." The sound of their voices was the sound of construction. My revenge, if you want to call it that, was not to go into the arena and shout. It was to make the truth the loudest noise in every room they wanted to control. And it started with people. witnesses who had seen the checks, the envelope, the condo purchase, people who could speak to the timeline of the money. We set about getting sworn statements from friends and neighbors. Maria signed one with trembling hands and then, within days, returned to work as if she had never left court. Alan, the accountant, provided prints of emails and sat for hours with a forensic accountant to explain what terms like support actually meant in the ledger language. We also set about training myself. Patricia had me rehearse telling the story out loud, in order, with dates and specifics. "Memory is not a feeling," she said. "It's a dossier." So I learned to keep that dossier. I wanted anyone who listened to be able to see, in their mind, the ledger. Nights of beans, the car with a heater that coughed, the borrowed suit, the club applause. I wanted them to know the way the words had landed in my chest. We brought in a handwriting expert to look at the forged signature. He telephoned us with the kind of deadpan joy forensic people have when they find something interesting. The expert explained, in a way that made me feel both small and vindicated, how the flattening in the pen stroke indicated a cut-and-paste scan technique. He showed us overlays where the signature deviated from mine at several points a human hand would never reproduce consistently. The forgery wasn't just sloppy, it was brazen. That brazen moved it from a family squabble to a serious crime. The expert's report became a lever. Then we began to set traps that weren't traps in the melodramatic sense. They were careful legal devices, deposition dates that required attendance, subpoenas to banks that could not be brushed aside, and witnesses whose statements were sworn under oath. We also requested digital records, because greed loves convenience, and convenience often leaves fingerprints. Emails, server backups, scanned images, all of it became a pathway. There is an almost perverse clarity in assembling digital footprints. They do not forget the parts we would like them to. At home, I worked the smaller theater of life. I changed the locks on my apartment, a little thing, but one that made me feel like I had agency. I traded the Ford for a small, reliable used car, and I slept with the folder of documents under my pillow like a talisman. Some would call it obsession. I called it survival. I also started to cultivate allies in public. The reporter who first picked up my short post wanted to do a longer piece, not to grandstand, but to expose a pattern. We worked with him to publish a careful narrative that did not name everyone but told the arc, the borrowed suit, the club toast, the missing money, the forged signature. The piece brought in more people. A woman wrote saying her elderly neighbor had experienced similar accounting shenanigans by the same firm. A man sent a photo of a checkbook that matched the handwriting we had. Each new message was a thread to pull. In private, there were small acts of daring. I attended parties where I knew members of his circle would be. Not to confront, that would be a fool's errand, but to let the light fall on them. People who believe their own press often stir when someone with nowhere to lose walks into their perfect little rooms. I watched them with the calm of a man who knows what he is prepared to do next. I also began recording more legally and carefully. I saved voicemails and asked for emails to be repeated in writing that I arranged to capture for the files. I recorded a conversation where my son suggested I needed a doctor. That tape became a small, bright shard of truth in court. He had laughed on the recording, a smooth, practiced laugh that tried to turn concern into mockery. "Maybe you need to see a doctor about your memory," he said. The voice on the tape was the marshaled voice of entitlement. Details like that matter in court. They tell a story in plain language: manipulation, concealment, and an attempt to reframe theft as caretaking. Jennifer would play that tape in the conference room for us, and then quietly she would say, "This is why victims don't come forward: the fear of being dismissed." We began to lay bait for the capacity claim they kept hinting at. I prepared friends and co-workers to testify to my day-to-day competence. Maria, who saw me manage a household and still come into work, rehearsed how she'd seen me balance my bills. Alan prepared to explain the emails. Janet from the grocery store agreed to speak about how I handled money and how I kept my shift schedule. The DA wanted continuity of behavior established, not because it would charm a jury, but because it would show I was not the easy target they had tried to paint me as. Meanwhile, my son's team attempted small economies of empathy. They offered settlements that were conditional, not real restitution, but a facade that would keep them out of court if I accepted. I refused. Patricia told me the sentence of those offers. They were a way to make the problem go away for them without actually admitting anything. If you accept a settlement that wipes your day-to-day pain away but leaves no record of wrongdoing, you have no justice and no public record. I wanted more than quiet comfort. I wanted the ledger to be accurate. The emotional core of the planning period, for me, was not the legal chessboard. It was the quiet moments when I had to reconcile how much of this fight would reshape my family. There is an ugly calculus to revenge. You cannot blast apart everything without feeling the splinters yourself. I thought about the son I had raised, about the toddler who once clung to my leg while I told him stories about the ocean. Those memories made what I did not do as significant as what I did. I never tried to use the law to publicly humiliate them for the sake of spectacle. My aim was narrower: to stop the theft, to reclaim my name. And then a small miracle of recklessness from their side gave the case a decisive edge. One morning, a clerk called and said the DA wanted to show us an internal accounting spreadsheet they had seized. The spreadsheet was a map of how funds moved across accounts, and in a column, a line read, "Allocate parent support, move via SM Holdings." Someone either careless or arrogant had left a comment. "He's not checking. Let's keep support number consistent." It read like an instruction to hide money in ways that would obscure the actual recipient. That single line read like a confession. Jennifer leaned back in her chair when she read it, the way someone does after seeing a puzzle fall into place. "They tried to create plausibility," she said. "They tried to build an appearance. That sentence, appearance, is what this fight turned on. They had created an appearance of generosity and used my name. We needed to show the substance behind the appearance. So we did. We scheduled depositions with the firm's accountants. We subpoenaed bank records back years. We cross-referenced check numbers with cash withdrawals and credit card purchases that had nothing to do with my care. We brought in a forensic accountant to trace the flow of money. There were transfers to Esmeralda's accounts, cash withdrawals the size of which would cover a mortgage, a condo purchase in cash by SM Holdings. It was all there in columns and decimal points, and it refused to look like a joke. The plan for the trial took shape like a photograph. We would show the timeline, play the tape, present the forgery analysis, and call witnesses who could testify to my daily life and habits. We would put the condo's purchase on display and show the return address that matched the envelope Maria had found. We would let the jury see the ledger, and with each slide the appearance of generosity would crumble. It was meticulous work. The nights were long. I made lists like a man praying to detail. Dates, names, exhibit numbers. I practiced telling the story in a way that was not bitter but true. I wanted jurors to feel for me, not because I was spectacular, but because what was done to me was wrong. There were small, surreal pleasures in this planning period, too. The first time a forensic accountant told me that the handwriting analysis was conclusive, I felt something like relief that felt almost like joy. When a bank document confirmed an SM Holdings transfer that matched our check copies, I felt vindicated in a way that happened in the body. A loosened jaw, a breath like a confession. But planning also brought me face to face with the fact that revenge has costs. When my son's trial date was set, I thought of the years of relationship that hung like laundry in between us. I thought of the people torn by telling the truth in public. I had a talk with Maria and with Alan and with Janet about what testifying would mean. They knew. They were ready. Their courage became part of my plan. And then the strategy that would ultimately become our revenge began to coalesce. Make them answer publicly in a court of law for using my name as an ornament. Force the ledger to speak. Force the people who had applauded to listen. Make the truth the thing that had the sound in the room. The courthouse smelled like old coffee and polished wood, the scent of other people's small anxieties. When I walked into the courtroom the morning the trial began, the room was a box with light at the top, like a theater where everyone had an assigned role. The defendants sat together, composed in a way that looked practiced, like actors learning how to look human under pressure. The DA's table was a neat pile of folders, and people who moved with the quiet of instruments. Patricia sat beside me like a silent sentinel, her hands folded, her jaw set in the way it does when she knows the law will do the heavy lifting. The judge called the case. The clerk read names. The first day was procedural, jury selection, instructions, the scraping of chairs. I watched faces walk into the courtroom and tried, in those small moments, to imagine each one as a human being and not a potential verdict. I thought about mercy and whether it mattered here, and then I placed thought gently aside. This was not a moral sermon. This was a ledger. We opened with the tape. Jennifer, calm, direct, stood and explained, short and clean, how we would lay out the story, timeline, documentation, the forgery, the money trail, and the human side of the theft. Then she played the recording where my son's voice suggested I needed a doctor. The room listened as someone's private derision unfurled in public. His voice on the tape laughed at me. The laugh lands different when people hear it replayed into a courtroom where it cannot be shrugged away. I testified first about the night at the club. I told the story the way Patricia had coached me, chronological, specific, concrete. He raised his glass and said, loud and proud, I give my father $10,000 a month so he can live comfortably. I could see the jurors' faces as I said the words. Some looked puzzled, some skeptical, most simply attentive. I described the suit I'd borrowed, the way the sleeves swallowed my hands, the heater at home that coughed when it was cold. I read the entries I'd photographed, the checks with Esmeralda's written where my name should have been. I watched the courtroom while I spoke and noticed small things. A lawyer's fingers steepled, a reporter jotting notes, the defendants' faces flickering as evidence pricked them. Maria took the stand and spoke with the kind of modest clarity only people who do quiet work have. I found the envelope, she said. I folded it and hid it in my apron until I could give it to Mr. H. She explained how she had gone about her day, how she'd seen checks, how she'd felt a thing that is familiar to anyone who sees something wrong, the ring of responsibility. Alan testified next. He did not use dramatic language. He spoke like an accountant, precise, careful, and devastating in how mundanely it undermined the defendant's story. He explained internal memos about account coding and how the firm was taught to make transfers appear as support when they were, in practice, rooted elsewhere. The forensic accountant presented diagrams that looked like the blueprint of a house, and in its lines we saw where funds had been shuttled, hidden in plain sight. The handwriting expert showed overlays of signatures, the flattening of a final letter that my real pen never made. It was a kind of technical demonstration that looks dry on paper, but in practice feels like someone setting fire to a lie. Then the cross-examinations. Their lawyers tried the usual things, suggest alternative explanations, say the labels could mean something else, paint the transfers as bureaucratic strategy. They raised questions about timing and intent. They tried to make the ledger look like a tangle rather than a map. I felt the first sting when a lawyer asked me, in a manner that sounded designed to dull, to explain how often I had cash in my pocket. It was meant to make me seem small, unreliable, and thereby the less sympathetic figure in the theater of the court. But the DA had curated the narrative carefully. Jennifer's cross-examination was precise. When did you first see these checks? What did you do after you saw them? Do you recognize your signature? These questions were the axes that carved down the confusing parts until what remained was a clear block of wood. Someone had forged my name. At the end of her questions, the jury had an exhibit or two in their hands. Copies of the checks, the envelope, bank statements with transfer trails. Sophia, my daughter-in-law, was a complicated witness. In other circumstances, I might have felt only pity. In the courtroom, where every word is a potential weapon, her testimony was a knife dressed as a confession. She described, in a voice that did not entirely meet mine, the rationalizations they had made for themselves. We thought it would help with planning. I remember the way she looked at me like someone apologizing for a broken appliance. Jennifer asked, simply, "Help who?" Sophia's answer was small and precise. "It helped us." That sentence landed in the courtroom like a stone. The defense tried to poke at Sophia's testimony, suggest coercion, suggest confusion. She held to her story. When she said she had signed certain documents, Jennifer produced a forensic analysis of the scans and found inconsistencies and edits. The notary stamp came from a contractor no longer employed by the firm. Files had been copied and altered. The defense's attempt to paint the actions as inadvertent planning melted away under the cold light of the evidence. One of the most humiliating moments for my son happened when Jennifer put a banker on the stand who had been tasked with reviewing transfers. The banker had a courthouse habit of speaking plainly. He explained how, to his eye, the transfers were organized and that checks written to S. Morales were not the kind of support payments that go to the person receiving care. When asked under oath whether he had seen similar patterns in elder abuse cases, he replied that he had. That sentence, the banker's professional identification of a pattern, reached across the court like a net. The defense, in its closing, tried to plead confusion and good intent. They painted my son as a man trying to protect his parents, a son of good intentions, who had maybe misinterpreted the way accounting labels worked. They used the language of love as armor. It was a performance, polished and practiced. But the jurors had seen the signatures, the emails, the condo paid for in cash by SM Holdings with the matching return address. The jury had heard Maria and Alan and the banker. They had heard the tape. When the jury left to deliberate, the courtroom felt like a held breath. Those 38 minutes between the closing and the jury's first note are the loneliest I have known. Patricia sat with me and said not much, that lawyer silence people mistake for stoicism. I paced a little in the corridor. The tile was cold, and my shoes made a small echo. I thought about all the small things that had led me here. The borrowed suit, the beans, the notary that didn't know he'd done a crime. When the jury returned, they did not read a long verdict. They read words that felt enormous. Guilty on charges including elder financial abuse, forgery, tax fraud, and conspiracy. The sound of guilty being uttered in that room made something loosen in me. It was not a fireworks moment. It was a wound unclenching. People wept quietly. Some of the defendant's friends looked away. My son's face did something I had not seen before. For a moment, the practiced mask fell and something like raw panic flashed in his eyes. It didn't last. He folded his hands and listened as the clerk read the verdict. The sentencing months later was less satisfying than you might imagine. Courts are careful machines. The judge spoke about harm and choices. He did not use my name much. The law prefers distance. My son received a sentence measured in years, which is to say, the system wrote a number where the ledger had written theft. His wife received a longer term because her role in planning had been shown to be more central. The DA pursued restitution in civil court. There was a settlement that replaced lost money, paid rent arrears, and, frankly, bought me a heater that did not cough. Those were small, practical restorations, but small things matter when your days are counted in rent and jars of beans. The aftermath of conviction was not drama. I had imagined fireworks the way men imagine revenge in movies, triumphal music, a door slamming. In reality, justice is a series of small administrative events. There were restitution hearings and quiet paper shuffling. There were changes of address and the shifting of accounts. What surprised me most was how ordinary the repair felt. A new lease, a slightly warmer apartment, a used car that did not complain in the cold. The settlement paid off debts that had been like low clouds. It offered dignity in the form of less panic at the end of the month. There were other surprises, too. People I had expected to disappear stayed. Margaret, who'd held my hand after the club, continued to call and check in. Alan slept better. Maria kept working, the apron marked with small stains that told me her hands were still willing. Patricia became a kind of companion I had not expected to need. She would sometimes call just to make sure I was eating properly. The reporter who first told the story followed up with a piece about elder financial abuse patterns, and more people came forward with similar stories. What had started as my fight became a chorus that helped others like me set up folders and call lawyers and protect signatures. And then there was the silence from my son. I never received a letter from him. I did not get his calls. There was no dramatic last scene, only a long, echoing absence. I had time to imagine many different endings. A son who begs forgiveness, a son who refuses to look me in the eye, a son who tries to rebuild. None happened. Grief is odd that way. You are allowed to grieve the absence of a person you have not truly lost and yet cannot reach. Sophia wrote me once from prison. Her handwriting was small, careful. She wrote, "I'm sorry. We thought it would help." I wrote back that forgiveness is not an on or off switch. It is a field one walks across sometimes and avoids other times. I said that I forgave small things and that larger things matter and will require time. I mailed the letter and waited to see if she would reply. She did not. The silence is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is the natural insulation between a life that has been altered and the person seeking to alter it. My life, after all this, did not cleanly return to how it had been. I found ways to make it smaller and kinder. I kept a job that let me speak to people and sometimes to sit in a church basement and talk about small protections, keep copies, take photos, have a trusted friend check statements. I began to travel to senior centers and banks and speak about what to do if someone says they are taking care of you. The irony was not lost on me. The father who had once been a prop at a banquet had now become an unlikely teacher. There were offers to write pieces and panels and an editorial column where the last paragraph would belong to a reader who had the courage to speak. I agreed. The column was not about revenge. It was about practices. Write down, stamp, photograph, ask for paper. The contentment I have now is not dramatic. It is a practical peace that comes from having my name back where it belongs. The legal outcome was justice, yes, but more than that, it became a civic lesson. Prosecutors told me that these cases are important because they break the illusion that money is always generous. They show how systems like accounting can be abused, and how ordinary people can become victims of their own goodwill. That knowledge turned my private outrage into a public service. It is a strange currency to be paid in, but it is still payment. There were nights when I would stand at the window and look at the street and remember the applause at the club. I would think about how cheaply people sometimes sell truth for a good story. I would reflect on how the world rewards performance and sometimes forgets substance. But I also thought about how a man can gather the small things, the recorder, the folder, the witness, and make them speak the truth. I was 59 when it all happened. Standing on stages now, when I was asked to speak, I would sometimes lift my hands and say, "Keep small things, date, photograph, call a lawyer, bring someone with you when you ask hard questions." This is not theater. This is survival. If there is a moral here, it is not righteous vengeance. It is slow and quiet work of reclaiming your name and insisting your life be treated as real, not as someone else's trophy. I did not want headlines that celebrated humiliation. I wanted my name back. I wanted to stop being used as a prop. The court gave me restitution, and the law returned the ledger to the truth. Those are not the same thing as healing, but they are practical repairs. More than that, this experience taught me how fragile trust can be and how resilient ordinary people are when they keep careful records and hold to the truth. I forgive in pockets. I forgive some small people, and I forgive myself for the simple human error of ever imagining that appearances are always generous. I took justice because justice is the instrument available to us. I did not chase cruelty. I built safeguards where I could and shared them with others. That is perhaps the gentlest kind of revenge. Not to humiliate, but to ensure no one else is humiliated in the same way. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. It helps these stories reach people who need them. Share in the comments. Have you or someone you love ever been used as a prop? What small practical tips would you add to my list? If you're dealing with something similar, please reach out to a trusted lawyer or local elder protection agency. You don't have to go it alone.